All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Lanslone Show. I have an episode that I am just very, very excited to bring you today. My guest is Michael Tracey. He is a journalist, political analyst, and I would say during the Trump era of America politics, which is quite a long time now. This is completely incidental. I believe today is the 10-year anniversary of Trump coming down the golden escalator and declaring that he was running for president. I don't think there's been anybody as insightful and as important as far as giving political commentary on Trump, on his movement, on the actions he may take. And that's all so important today as we're looking and watching events unfold in the Middle East. What is the U.S. going to do? What's going on with Donald Trump, Iran, Israel? So, Michael, I want to talk to you about all that today and more. But first, just how are you doing?
Well, thank you for the kind introduction. Yeah, I guess it's been 10 years. Was it June 15th or 16th that he came down the escalator? Either way, we're pretty close to the exact 10-year mark, and it's been quite a long decade. So I guess let's just dive into it.
Right. I have a few topics I want to talk to you about today. First, I want to mention to people you are at M Tracy on Ed, so definitely worth a follow, and mtracy.net for all of the articles that you write. Just tons and tons of great stuff there.
M
Uh,
Tracy on YouTube too, which I don't do as good a good enough job promoting. So
all right.
all the same name.
Yeah, definitely check out his channel. His streams have been great too. So I want to talk to you about a few things today. Trump's Iran policy. Was a deal even possible? Will Trump attack Iran? And just Trump's overall reputation as a deal maker. So to start off here with Trump's Iran policy, I want to bring up this tweet of yours that you put out pretty recently. And I just think it's so insightful and important on what's happening right now in the Middle East. So if we could pull up this tweet, you write, this isn't what Trump's base voted for, and that's in quotes. Trump drastically intensified acrimony with Iran during his first term and aligned unwaveringly with Israel. He promised to continue both policies in his second term, and he delivered. So, yes, this is what they voted for. And today, especially as a libertarian, Michael, I'm hearing a lot of people saying, I'm turning on Donald Trump. I no longer support Donald Trump. But as you're pointing out here, is this what we should have expected Donald Trump to do?
Well, yeah, I had this recurring debate with libertarians and others last year during the 2024 campaign that was increasingly frustrating and flummoxing because libertarians in particular, but also this broader, what you might call vaguely anti-establishmentarian contingent in the alternative media and similar places, imbued Trump with a kind of political credibility that was very potent in 2024, where he went on all these podcasts that kind of vaguely intersect with that inchoate political tendency. And the idea was that Trump would somehow dismantle the deep state, quote unquote, that he was going to overturn the military industrial complex, that he was opposed to new wars, etc. Not that much different, really, from what he campaigned on in 2016. And then I would think if you're a rational observer of American politics, you would then go and analyze the record of the first Trump administration to see if it was consistent with the rhetoric that was espoused during the campaign. It's what you should do if you're a rational observer with any political figure, right? But Trump seems to have existed in this domain where the ordinary rules of political scrutiny don't apply to him. And so there was this big effort among libertarian leaning people, vaguely anti establishmentarian people in 2024 to rally around Trump. Some of this was understandable aversion to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. I certainly didn't support either Harris or Biden, but especially inhabiting the online environments that I tend to inhabit, it seemed like the bulk of the confusion, now you might even say propaganda, that was being promulgated was in favor of Trump. So I had discussions or debates with this with people like Dave Smith, who just I saw today came out and declared that he should have never supported Trump and he's repudiating him and even calling for him to be impeached. Well, if you're calling, and I have nothing personally against Dave Smith, I find him to be a fairly affable guy to the extent that I've had interactions with him. But if within a matter of months into the presidency that you advocated in favor of installing, you're suddenly going to have this extreme repudiation based on a sequence of events that were eminently foreseeable and substantiated by all available credible evidence and foretold by what went on when the person who you were supporting was in power the previous time. I think there might be something awry with whatever political intuitions led to the position that you were espousing in the first place. And so, with Iran, what am I talking about in particular? Well, I mean, we can go through the record. Trump in 2016 campaigned on withdrawing from the JCPOA, the Obama era Iran nuclear deal, which people should recall or people should research if maybe they're not old enough to remember, was vehemently opposed by the so called Israel lobby in 2015. Netanyahu even came to Congress at the invitation of congressional Republicans to deliver a speech to a joint session of Congress inveighing against the policy that was basically the signature foreign policy initiative of the US president. That policy ended up getting implemented anyway over the objections of the so called Israel lobby, which seems to indicate that it's not as insurmountable or all powerful as a lot of people are trying to suggest now to sort of absolve Trump of responsibility or agency from the current policy with respect to the new war in Iran, with the idea being that Trump's instinct was not to go to war with Iran. He really doesn't like war. He really wants peace. That's always his pure hearted instinct. It just so happens that he ends up appointing extreme interventionists to prominent administration positions in both terms. And he's always being cajoled or manipulated into acting contrary to his supposed interests. But I mean, let's look at the record and let me know if I'm going on too long. But in the first term, Trump campaigned on exactly what he ended up doing, which was withdrawing from the JCPOA. I'm not saying you can't have certain critiques of the JCPOA from a variety of different perspectives, but it at least did succeed in containing tensions or hostilities with Iran such that it significantly diminished the possibility of a war breaking out because there was a multilateral framework, not just with the United States, but with Russia, China, the EU, to subject Iran to certain limitations as to its nuclear enrichment capacity in exchange for sanctions, relief, and other things. It was authorized by the UN Security Council. I'm not a huge fan necessarily in all respects of these international institutions, but you could argue that having a robust international backing to a policy with respect to minimizing tensions with Iran is preferable than what Trump ended up bringing in his second term, which was this highly compressed, seemingly arbitrary 60-day time frame for so-called negotiations with Iran, which he delegated to his personal envoy Steve Witkoff. And Witkoff eventually ended up declaring that the only satisfactory quote unquote deal that could be made with Iran in this truncated, compressed 60-day time frame. Compare that with the JCPOA, which took over 2 years to meticulously negotiate. Witkoff declared that the only acceptable resolution from the US standpoint was for Iran to agree to eliminate its uranium enrichment and dismantle its nuclear facilities effectively, which, if you follow this issue for any length of time, you'll know Iran would regard that as essentially a huge self inflicted national humiliation imposed on them or forced upon them by this imperial power as they see it on the other side of the world. And that to agree to such a condition would basically be to forfeit its national sovereignty, which
Hmm.
is why a compromise was attained in the context of the Obama era um, negotiation. And so this was a very much foreseeable. I mean, the idea that people are going to claim that they've been betrayed or they were hoodwinked or they were deceived because occasionally Trump or his surrogates like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or Tulsi Gabbard would spout these vague platitudes about how Trump was averse to war in the abstract, or that he was seeking peace, or because Trump went to Muslim predominant areas of Michigan and repeated similar vagaries. The idea that because you, for some reason, credulously bought into that, but ignored the very specific policy details of what Trump did in his first term and what he was pledging to do in a second, such as, for example, threatening, Trump openly did this in the 2024 campaign, threatening to bomb Iran to smithereens, amplifying this idea that Iran tried to assassinate him, which just yesterday Netanyahu repeated as part of his justification for waging this current offensive with US support. Trump even openly advocated that Israel be permitted to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities and criticized Biden for not aggressively supporting Israel enough.
Yeah, and I actually think I have one of these clips of Donald Trump threatening to attack Iran's nuclear facilities and criticizing Joe Biden. If we could play that clip.
They asked him, "What do you think about Iran? Would you hit Iran?" And he goes, "As long as they don't hit the nuclear stuff." That's the thing you want to hit, right? I said, I think he's got that one wrong. Isn't that the one you're supposed to hit? I mean, it's the biggest risk we have. Nuclear weapons, the power of nuclear weapons, the power of weaponry. You know, I rebuilt the entire military, jets, everything. I built, including nuclear, and I hated to build the nuclear, but I got to know firsthand the power of that stuff, and I'll tell you what, we have to be totally prepared. We have to be absolutely prepared. But when they asked him that question, the answer should have been, hit the nuclear first.
Yeah, and you know, so of course, Trump is a bit of an unusual political figure in that he'll flood the zone with an endless spigot of often seemingly contradictory statements, right? Which is why you have to have some level of discernment in how you evaluate what he says and does. A helpful heuristic at this point, I would have thought, although I was in the extreme minority, particularly in this anti establishment, quote unquote, podcasting clique, would be to look at what he did in the first term. You know, that was kind of discarded. And people just signed on to pleasing sounding slogans. But yeah, I mean, that was very much out in the open that Trump was supporting, advocating for Israel to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. And he surrounded himself with the most fanatical, quote unquote, pro Israel elements in the 2024 campaign, just like he had during the 2016 campaign and the 2020 campaign. So, like, at a certain point, if you're going to feign this sort of incredulity that Trump could have done things that couldn't have been more unambiguously telegraphed over the course of a full decade, then I think that really does count against your credibility as a political analyst. I think a lot of what happened was there was audience capture in these libertarian slash anti-establishment media outlets where, by and large, their audiences supported Trump or were antagonistic enough against um, the Democrats that they felt it was just a no-brainer to support Trump. They rightly were aware of a lot of the genuinely egregious, quote unquote, deep state machinations that Trump was subjected to during his first term. I was very much critical of those machinations, in addition to the prosecutions of Trump while he was out of office. Uh, so a lot of this stuff got conflated into a really severe misapprehension of what his policy plans would be or his policy trajectory would be in a second term. Because again, so much of this was very easily telegraphed and foreseeable. Trump got into office and almost immediately started vowing that if Iran doesn't, quote, make a deal, they're going to get bombed, the likes of which they've never seen before. I mean, he would call media outlets and say this openly. And then people think, oh, Trump's a deal maker. He's just trying to negotiate. He's bluffing. He really wants peace, which is why he's opening this opportunity for some kind of negotiating settlement. But then if you do like 2 seconds of work or analysis to drill down into the nature of the supposed deal that Trump was trying to obtain, you could have surmised fairly easily that the negotiations were doomed from the outset by design, it seems, because the only acceptable negotiating endpoint was one that anybody who had even the most minimal knowledge of this issue knew that Iran was never going to accept. So, uh, and then Trump, the day after the bombing started on Friday morning, put out a Truth Social post essentially acknowledging that this whole negotiating exercise was pretextual, which, among other things, would seem to obliterate the credibility of any negotiations in other theaters that are highly sensitive, such as Ukraine, Russia, or with Hamas, or with other uh, conflicts that might arise over the course of his tenure. Um, so, yeah, I mean, I do find this frustrating. I think that there was a big media failure that culminated the night that the bombings were announced, where you had all these pundits and influencers who have become increasingly skeptical of Israel,
Mhm.
especially since October 7th and the Gaza war, twisting themselves into pretzels to try to postulate some scenario whereby Trump was once again suckered into this or tricked into supporting this bombing offensive, or it was done without his approval, or it was done somehow in a way that undermined his authority or undercut his preference for negotiations. And I think that's a function of the online media ecosystem. On the one hand, having this sizable contingent of people who are, as I said, increasingly skeptical of Israel, but also for a variety of reasons, they must maintain their foundational position of being kind of presumptively pro Trump. And those positions were never really rationally reconcilable from my perspective, but they felt like they had to take up that posture, whether they were kind of self deluded, whether because they kind of cater to a more right leaning audience or a quote anti establishment audience, they had to maintain the Trump support or else the audience would evaporate, or for a variety of other reasons of like confirmation bias. There's a lot of different factors that kind of created this weird mass psychology. But it didn't take that long for it to come to a head in a very open and unmissable way. Although I think, again, A lot of it was foretold even by the first couple of months of Trump's term, where his first big foreign policy proposal in the first week of February was to come out and say that the U.S. is going to seize Gaza and turn it into a U.S. military protectorate. Uh,
Yeah.
and then he greenlights Netanyahu's uh, end stage annihilation campaign in Gaza. And still, like, there's always these murmurings or these weird theories being proffered about how there's a rift or a conflict or tension between Trump and Netanyahu. And I think now, none of that was particularly credible, even contemporaneously. But now, if you're still buying into some version of that, I think you've obliterated all credibility in a way that maybe is not recoverable.
Yeah, and so this is a great where I want to take the conversation next, which was there ever a deal even on the table for what was it even possible for Iran to make a deal with the US? I mean, Trump only gave this deal a 60-day deadline, and midway through that period, Steve Witkoff is saying that we're going to allow enrichment. You have other Trump officials saying they're not going to allow enrichment. But then we also have this statement from Netanyahu following the Iranian strikes that the Israeli strikes on Iran that I think make it fairly clear. Let's play this next clip.
When did you tell President Trump you were going to launch these strikes?
Look, I've been in constant contact with President Trump. We've known each other for many years. And obviously, we informed our American friends and President Trump, our great friend, ahead of time. We did. He knew about it, of course.
Yeah, and Witkoff did go on TV. Maybe it was in April or something, and vaguely allude to the possibility that Iran might be able to maintain a certain low level of uranium enrichment, 3.67%, which was precisely the level they were allowed to maintain under the Obama era JCPOA. Witkoff was not really that clear or definitive when he sort of floated that possibility. But then, sure enough, the very next morning, he put out a statement on his official government X account saying, reiterating that the position was no enrichment whatsoever. Then you had Rubio come out and underscore that, and Trump himself came out and underscored it, both in media appearances and on Truth Social. So the position was clear, and if that was the position that the U.S. was going to non-negotiably stick to, then I don't see how anybody who's rational could have projected that any sort of non-violent outcome was obtainable. So um, it and that's the position of no enrichment, right, and total dismantlement of nuclear facilities. That's the position that has always been espoused by anti-Iranian Israeli actors. Like, that's the position that was promoted by Netanyahu and his cohort, and also hardcore congressional Republican anti-Iranian hawks, who, to the extent that they could tolerate or countenance quote unquote negotiations, it was if those negotiations were predicated on the most hardline possible position and then could be used as a pretext to then justify the eventual initiation of a bombing campaign. So, no, I don't understand how a deal could have been even viable if this was the U.S. position. It seems much more like the negotiations simply were like a public facade to eventually achieve the outcome that was desired, even if Trump, like, maybe in some like corner of his brain might have preferred some negotiated settlement, or even if he thought, like, through the power of his personality he could somehow convince Iran to dismantle its entire its national nuclear infrastructure. That may well be the case. I think Trump probably also, on some level, thought that he could end the Ukraine war in 24 hours, right? I mean, so at a certain point, like, whatever sort of like conflicting sentiments that might be bouncing around in his cranium aren't really that dispositive of anything. But it's still the case that the negotiations were structured in such a way that it made untenable any sort of genuine diplomatic outcome.
Yeah. Move on to the next question. Just want to ask the audience to share the show. We are just under 2,000 people now watching live, and so we could certainly get that number higher if people just take a second to hit the share button wherever you're listening, if that's X or YouTube. Now, the next question I want to ask you is kind of, where do we go from here? Will Trump attack Iran? It seems that, and this is coming from Israeli sources that I'm reading, Israel has essentially bit off more than it could chew here, where, yes, they've done significant damage to Iran, its nuclear sites, maybe its air defenses, but sites like the Fordow nuclear site are still functioning, are buried deep underground, and it would take American military support to actually do significant damage to that. And I spoke with Scott Horton, who's my boss at antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, yesterday, and he was saying that he has sources saying that the U.S. is prepared and is going to happen early this week, likely, to enter this conflict on behalf of the Israelis and start striking Iran. So, Michael, what are your thoughts here? Do you think Trump's going to go down this road to direct intervention?
Well, this might seem superficially contradictory to what I've said thus far, but I do think that it is plausible that the rationale of the Israelis and of the Trump administration in concert with Israel for why this was a historically opportune time to take the leap, cross the threshold, and actually attempt to topple Iran or destroy its nuclear facilities. That rationale seems pretty plausible, meaning it is true that, for example, as of December, there's been regime change in Syria. So we now have Israeli fighter jets refueling over Syrian territory, which would have been unimaginable before. And basically, it seems being given free rein to transit over Syria in furtherance of conducting this offensive. Um, it is the case, by all available accounts, as far as I can tell, that Hezbollah, which is, people call it an Iranian proxy. Maybe that's not quite the right word, but it is an entity that has received Iranian support, has been degraded to the point where it's now not even conceived as being a plausible participant in pushing back against Israel. Hamas has been degraded, obviously not enough for the Israeli government to think that it has to be like 100% completely annihilated and the entirety of Gaza flattened and the Palestinian inhabitants expelled in accordance with what Trump has advocated for an end game in Gaza. But, those factors do seemingly add up to a historically opportune time for Israel to take this action if they were ever going to. And so Iran, paradoxically, at least at this point, would not seem to have this formidable state capacity or military capacity that a lot of the most ardent anti-Iranian sort of operators in the US and Israel have spent years hysterically lecturing us we had to be so existentially concerned about. Israel is now claiming that they have complete free reign in the airspace of Tehran. So if it's true that for example, the Iranian air defenses have been so disabled where Israel can basically fly over Iranian skies with impunity, then that says something about the diminished state capacity of Iran and why they're potentially vulnerable to a regime change operation right now. I sometimes think back to last year when the president of Iran was killed in a helicopter crash, supposedly due to inclement weather. A lot of people thought at the time, oh, this has to be a cover story. Maybe Mossad did it. Maybe the CIA did it, etc. But every Iranian state official came out and acknowledged that it was just a accident due to poor weather. Now, who knows? Maybe like at some point down the line, we'll learn more details about that. But either way, like Iran, to call it a paper tiger might be a little bit insulting, but I don't think it's too far off. And so if the final like goal here that is yet to be achieved is taking out the deep underground Iranian nuclear facility that's buried under a mountain, and the only way it can be done is with the US bunker busting bombs, I don't really see much reason to doubt why that wouldn't be done.
Yeah.
Much reason to doubt that wouldn't be done. It's hard to predict the future. Um, you can maybe envision like in a week or two if if there's like an economic crisis that stems from this, having to do with oil prices or whatnot, that Trump might hedge a bit. But the current trajectory seems pretty clear. And either way, I think there's a false dichotomy being set up by some people. Like I saw Candace Owens saying something to this effect, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are again still wedded to basically trying to absolve Trump of agency for what's going on, saying that they're against American involvement in this war, as if there isn't already American involvement. US military assets across the region are being marshaled in support of Israel. US service personnel are already involved in shooting down incoming Iranian ballistic missiles. Anybody who thought initially that Iran would not launch, or Israel would not launch such an audacious campaign without the coordination or facilitation of the US was just in a dream world.
Yep.
Israel, just like, if you study the nature of the Israel-US relationship, you'll know that Israel is fundamentally an appendage of the US to begin with. The source of its power to even wage these offensives is the relationship with the US. So I think there's a false dichotomy being set up by the sort of dead enders who still want to vaguely assert some sort of distance between the Trump administration and the Israeli government, which I would probably suspect is going to become progressively untenable, however untenable it may be at this juncture.
Right. And so I want to wrap up here. One last question, Michael. We get all this commentary about how Trump is supposed to be the great deal maker. And as far as I could tell, the guy hasn't made any deals. He got rid of the Iran nuclear deal. He scrapped open skies and INF during his first administration. He ramped up tensions with Ukraine. He never got a deal done with North Korea. But then people will say, aha, Afghanistan. He made a deal with the Taliban and that war ended. And you, I think, have been certainly the most prominent, and at times the only political commentator in the United States who has really taken Trump to task for the fact that he has been very explicit that that's actually not his plan. And so kind of fill us in on the details there about what Trump wanted to do.
Well, yeah, there's an interesting parallel to be made between the Trump Afghanistan policy and the current Trump Israel Iran policy, which is that there were fairly taboo busting negotiations that were initiated by Trump in his first term with the Taliban. Remember, he at one point was reportedly going to even invite the Taliban to Camp David. That was then scuttled. But direct negotiations were still undertaken with the Taliban to presumably bring about an end to the US war there after, almost 2 decades. And in early 2020, Mike Pompeo, who was then Trump's Secretary of State, brokered what was then called the Doha Agreement, which, among other things, called for the removal of all U.S. personnel from Afghanistan, including evacuation from all remaining U.S. bases. Biden then actually did implement the substance of that plan in 2021, but then Trump, while he was out of office and then gearing up for the 2024 campaign, and then during the 2024 campaign, essentially admitted that the Doha Agreement framework was also a ruse. Trump never planned on fully withdrawing from Afghanistan. He instead was going to maintain a U.S. occupation presence at Bagram Air Base, with thousands of U.S. troops and who knows how many ancillary personnel and contractors. And even to maintain that very base would entail virtually inevitably the continuation of U.S. combat operations in Afghanistan, because obviously the Taliban was not going to suddenly have an epiphany and say, okay, forget what we were just like waging an insurgency for the past 20 years. We're now just going to happily allow for or sign off on the continuation of an occupying U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. And yeah, that you're right. That got virtually no coverage in 2024. Sometimes I felt like I was shouting into the void just to get it on people's radar, but it was pretty significant. As to the, and, you know, there's always a bit of like complexity analyzing Trump. It is true that he never adhered really to the kind of nostrums that might have made other presidents reluctant to, for example, engage in direct diplomacy with a figure like Kim Jong-un. Because the idea pre-2016 would have been that to engage in direct diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, particularly in the Republican Party, this would have been the dominant sensibility, would be to give Kim Jong-un a certain kind of credibility or stature, and therefore no direct diplomacy ought to be conducted with him. Obama actually also somewhat deviated from that consensus. Remember, he met Raul Castro in Cuba. He did have a certain degree of direct negotiations with Iran pursuant to the JCPOA and so forth. But Trump also, basically jettisoned this taboo that said it was inherently discrediting to have negotiations with publicly reviled leaders who are deemed to be adversaries of the United States. But what you have to do is then maintain some degree of mooring in the actual policy outcomes, because although there were two successive summits held with Kim Jong-un in 2019, something very similar to what happened just these past few months happened, in that there was no budging on the part of the U.S. in terms of the underlying policy conditions. Right? Trump also thought over the course of those North Korea negotiations that through the force of his personality and by exchanging like love letters with Kim Jong-un, he could somehow convince North Korea to abandon its nuclear program, and then they could build Trump hotels on the coast of North Korea or something. Obviously, that didn't come to pass. So there was no deal made. There was a temporary sort of reprieve in brinksmanship between the U.S. and North Korea. Like there was a period of a few months where North Korea didn't fire any missiles into the Sea of Japan and so forth. So even the attempt at negotiations was productive in that sense, but it then just didn't add up to anything that was substantive or long-lasting on a policy level. And so you got to imagine that part of that stems from Trump presenting himself and a lot of his followers and supplicants promoting this notion that he has this world historic deal-making prowess without actually analyzing the underlying substance of those purported deals. And you can make a similar argument, I guess, for the tariff-related deals. It's kind of in a different category, but particularly on the foreign policy domain, to simply posture and pontificate about how easy it is to be doing deals while retaining maximalist or status quo enforcing policy postures doesn't seem like it's had the greatest track record. Similar with Ukraine. I mean, Pete Hegseth was testifying before Congress last week and verified that the Biden era arms provision policy to Ukraine is still in effect under the Trump administration. And Trump seems to be almost washing his hands now of any prospect that he could mediate for some sort of negotiated resolution in Ukraine. I think that policy area is a little bit different um, than Iran, but it does sort of bolster this overriding theme about the popular image of Trump as a deal maker not really being tethered to any real policy record. And I do actually think people should read The Art of the Deal. I read it many years ago. Maybe I'll reread it now to understand how running phony negotiations with Iran as a pretext for launching war is analogous to acquiring an ice skating rink in Central Park in 1986. But in that book, I mean, he talks about how he does this like positive psychology essentially, where he tries to will outcomes into existence. And he engages in like truthful, what he calls truthful hyperbole. And um, that might work on some level for New York real estate deals. But I think the transferability to massively consequential and deadly foreign policy conflicts or foreign policy issues was not always the most obvious. And yet, in this 10-year saga we've been on, people still buy into it with very little critical scrutiny.
Yeah. Well, Michael, excellent analysis. That is the time we have for today, but I could tell the audience loves you. The chat is very active, very positive. We have over 2,500 people watching live now. So I really appreciate you coming on the show today and giving us your insights on Trump as, you know, his tenure in politics, I guess, is officially here. And I hope to have you back on the show sometime in the future.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.